The Miami Dolphins are facing some ideological changes with the addition of Anthony Weaver as the team's defensive coordinator in 2024. How does the team's personnel currently compare to the team that Weaver was last a part of, the 2023 Baltimore Ravens?
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We are locked in on the defensive side of the ball here today on the show and looking specifically at the depth chart and how the depth chart compares to the depth chart for Anthony Weaver's last stop. He, of course, was not the defensive coordinator in Baltimore with the Ravens. That title went to Mike McDonald, not Mike McDaniel, Mike McDonald, who's now the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. But Anthony Weaver was a prominent figure on that coaching staff, looks to bring that same ideology from Baltimore with some overlap to what the Dolphins did under Vic Fangio in 2023. But some big changes, and some of those big changes are going to be very quickly identified. So want to look at the depth chart and look at where the Dolphins are equal to, lesser than, or greater than the Baltimore Ravens depth chart from last year. And part of this is parsing out who plays a lot of snaps, who rotates a lot, how much depth do you need in certain rooms. And it kind of helps to paint the picture to look back at what Baltimore had last year. So if you're not familiar with the project that Joe Marino and I do over on Locked On NFL Scouting, we watch all 32 teams individually, and then we put the players into buckets. And the objective being we want to quantify the caliber of your roster by identifying who your roster cornerstones, who your quality starters, who your adequate level starters, who are replacement level starters, who's quality depth, who are like the rookies, who are incomplete evaluations, guys that haven't played enough for you to really know yet, who are practice squad and non-roster caliber players. You don't see a lot of those last two that play, and you certainly didn't see a lot of it for the Baltimore Ravens and their depth chart last year. They had an outstanding unit. They were graded for us as having 4 cornerstone players, and we already did the 2024 version and updated this depth chart for Baltimore. But if I use the depth chart from last year with the end of season performance grades, Justin Madubuike, Roquan Smith, Marcus Williams, Kyle Hamilton, those are cornerstone talents on the defense. That's a healthy number. And you get one on each level of the defense to go with quality starters in Jadeveon Clowney, who's no longer with the team, and Odafe Owe, and Michael Pierce and Patrick Queen, who transitioned to Pittsburgh, and Marlon Humphrey at corner amidst some of his injuries. You very quickly get the sense this two deep was loaded with a lot of talent. Now, they weren't able to retain everyone, and that's for a lot of the contenders in the AFC, be it Baltimore or Buffalo. I think Kansas City's, unfortunately, in their own separate conversation because of some of the transitions they've made in the past couple of years, and they have the best quarterback in the league by a hop, skip, and a jump. So the things that they're able to do, it's a little different. And their salary cap perspective is reflective of that. But Baltimore, they've experienced some attrition in the depth chart. You know, we mentioned losing quality starter in Patrick Queen, losing quality starter in Jadeveon Clowney. And the guys that they have coming up through the pipes are lesser proving guys like Trenton Simpson, who played 46 snaps defensively at linebacker. He was the 4th linebacker off the boat for the Ravens last year. They got Tavius Robinson as their next kind of edge guy up. He played 83 snaps for him last year. And with Clowney gone, they bring back Kyle Van Noy. That's a big hit for them. But that's not really our focus today. Instead, it's kind of looking at where is the quality, who played the most snaps, how do the Dolphins compare with that snap workload? I'll say this. I think Baltimore, their secondary was the most impressive unit that they had. It's a secondary-driven group. I think you include the linebackers in there. The back seven was really the strength and the identifying piece of the unit. I think you see some parallels with what Miami chose to do with transitioning away from Xavier Howard, but bringing in Kendall Fuller. Marlon Humphrey, Brandon Stevens. Humphrey missed some time. He played about 560 snaps defensively for Baltimore last year, 541. And then the backup was Ronald Darby, who played 442. And the corner on the opposite side was Brandon Stevens, and he played over 1,000 snaps defensively. So your two outside corners combined for about 2,000 snaps, right? Humphrey's a quality starter when he's healthy. Injuries are slowing him down a little bit. Stevens has developed quickly into an adequate level starter, and I think there's probably room for him to continue to grow. He's a nice physical player. Their primary nickel, Arthur Mole, only played 400 snaps because their third safety, Marcus Williams, played 636 snaps to go along with 951 snaps for Geno Stone and 937 snaps for Kyle Hamilton. So they had three safeties over 600 snaps. Do the Dolphins have that right now? No, but also maybe kind of yes. We'll get into it. The linebackers was the unit that was rock solid. It was Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen. Those guys both played over 1,050 snaps defensively, 1067 and 1121. And the next guy down was Malik Harrison with under 200 snaps. So Miami going out and getting David Long and Jordan Brooks. Miami has a little bit more depth, but with adding Anthony Walker from Cleveland in free agency and still having Duke Riley and Channing Tindall, who knows, in year 3. I think Miami has a little bit of a deeper group than Baltimore did. But then up front, the rotations are really fascinating, where there was one edge player that played more than 500 snaps for the Ravens last year, which is Jadeveon Clowney, played 657. There was two interior defensive linemen who played more than 500 snaps for Baltimore last year. It was Justin Matabweek, played 757, and Michael Pierce played 640. Next in line was 453. Now, I think Baltimore, with what they had personnel-wise, Clowney, Owe, Pierce, Matabweek, those are, there's a cornerstone there, Matabweek, and 3 quality starters. But then Van Noyes, your third edge guy, was an adequate level starter as your third edge. And he missed the first 4 games of the season before even signing in Baltimore. Travis Jones, I think he'd start in a lot of places at nose tackle, but he's behind Michael Pierce for the Ravens. I have him down as an adequate level starter. So they're running 3 deep in just about every spot on this defense. A few exceptions. I think corner's a spot. We'll get there and talk about them in the back 7. But just looking at what Baltimore had, obnoxious amounts of rotation up front and a lot of stability behind it. Wanted to keep guys fresh up front. It's a little bit of a departure from what Miami's done. Now we'll talk about who they have, the discrepancies, and as far as the depth, but also the top ends of each of these position rooms. And that's going to come up next here on Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you stick with us. It is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So up front, if you had me hold up the Dolphins' current edge room versus Baltimore's edge room last year, I would say Miami's got a better group. And you don't know when the return for Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips exactly is going to happen. And that leaves and sows some unknown where you may need, you may end up needing somebody else early to kind of come in and be a part of the mix for you. But where things currently stand with Chubb and Phillips, I think they're both respectfully better than Clowney and Owe. And when that group is able to get on the field, well, maybe they take a little bit of time to kind of get their feet underneath of them from a quality of play standpoint. But Chubb and Phillips at their best are respectfully better than both Clowney and Owe. And then you get into Shaq Barrett versus Kyle Van Noy, and I have both of those guys down as adequate level starters at this stage of their careers. I think once upon a time, both of those guys were probably a tier up and quality starters. You love that they are probably going to be rotational guys for you from the jump. And then the fourth edge, Tavius Robinson, I misspoke. I mentioned 83 snaps, but that was David Ajabo's snaps. Tavius Robinson played 335 snaps. So the fourth edge played 335 snaps for the Ravens last year. Incomplete player, flashed a little bit, still a developmental guy. I think Chop Robinson could come in and be the exact same kind of player. And then you have Muhammad Kamara behind it for the Dolphins specifically. I think they'll go out and they probably will get another edge guy if Chubb or Phillips is not going to be ready for the start of the season. So maybe if one of them starts on the PUP, you kind of look, if one of those guys slides out and everybody else from the depth chart slides up a little bit, you'd say at the beginning of the year, maybe last year's Baltimore group has an edge. But when it's at full strength, Miami's group is better at the top, and I think it's deeper. And that's no small thing because the fourth edge guy for the Ravens last year played 335 snaps. So maybe we should have done this content before the draft. Maybe edge would have been a bigger part of the conversation. And we knew it was one of the primary needs for the team, right? Just because of the injuries to Chubb and Phillips. But there's some long-term discussions about paying some of these guys too, that I think becomes a very fascinating storyline if you're going to continue to rotate guys at the degree in which Baltimore did last year. If that's going to be part of your identity, what you invest in big money there is an interesting subplot. And maybe elite guys changes what the rotation looks like. Who knows? But it's a source subplot to kind of keep an eye on as the year goes. For sure, you are now outgunning Baltimore's interior defensive front. I'll say that with complete confidence. They had 5 guys take almost 300 snaps last year. So they had 4 guys take over 300 snaps on the edge. And they had 4 guys take over 400 snaps on the interior. And then Neville Gallimore, or not Neville Gallimore, Brent Urban was their 5th guy in their interior rotation, and he played 280 snaps last season. So 457 for Adam Weeks, 640 for Michael Pierce, 453 for Travis Jones, 411 for Broderick Washington, and then 280 for Brent Urban. I think Zach Sealer is an outstanding football player. I do think Matt Abweek in this system probably has a little bit of an edge from a pass rush explosiveness, first step explosiveness. Sealer's not far off the pace, though. If you wanted to argue that they were both in the same bucket, I would hear you. I personally have Matt Abweek in a cornerstone bucket and Zach Sealer in the quality starter bucket, as far as just like he's an upper echelon starter, but like I see a cornerstone of the unit. He's probably going to earn it this year with what's going to be responsible for him if he's going to take over 757 snaps and be one of 2 guys over 500. And they're going to be one of their primary penetration players because Tier Tart, some flashes, consistency, passing down upside, is it there? Jonathan Harris, what's the pass rush upside? Benito Jones, what's the pass rush upside? Neville Gallimore is kind of the other guy that's like a predominant penetration type player. So their distribution out of that group is going to be interesting, but just based off the volume, we look at these half dozen guys that they've added, and most of them are going to play and play meaningful snaps. But Pierce, quality starter, Matt Abweek, cornerstone, Travis Jones, adequate starter. The only guy that I have higher than like a quality depth player right now is Zach Sealer for the Dolphins interior defensive front. So Baltimore certainly has better top end talent I think Miami's group is a little deeper, but the difference between Pierce and Tart and Travis Jones and Benito Jones, those are pretty big gaps. So the ceiling of what those guys are able to do is going to be dependent on what Miami currently has, or them alternatively finding one other name that would be a step up, which I think would change the DNA of the entire unit. It's one of my favorite position groups to kind of look at and want Miami to add something else to the mix. Either somebody's going to have to elevate within this scheme and be a really good fit to kind of emerge, or Miami's going to have to find a player that's elsewhere to add in, which I think puts them back in a conversation of, depending on how good the players that they could find, to have an equal group, or they're going to have a better edge group and a little bit of a lesser interior group that maybe is a little less sexy and has a little bit less splash appeal than what Matabweek and even Pierce as a nose tackle did. So that's the defensive line. You have 9 snap takers with over 280 snaps. 8 of them are over 330. So expect a lot of rotation. The good news for Miami is these groups are pretty deep. On the edge, I think at their best, they have better talent. On the inside, not so much. But the back 7, as we said, is kind of where there's a lot more static play. The players who are there are the players who are there, and they're going to be the identifying pieces for you. There's a lot of situational stuff up front, heavy-handed edge setters, reduction pass rush guys inside, two-gapping nose tackles. Like there's a lot of variety with the kinds of guys that you have. Whereas the guys in the back are responsible for being the guys in the back and having athleticism and physicality and speed and all of that. It's all required of you. Now, how you split certain positional responsibilities creates certain subplots for the back 7, and comparing Baltimore from last year to Miami this year. And we're going to get into that next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So stick with us. Going to the game is not supposed to be stressful because you love sports and you want to be able to decide randomly that you want to go to the game, whether that's the baseball game or the NBA Finals or the NHL Eastern Conference Finals with the Florida Panthers, who are going to look to bounce back after 2 overtime losses to the Rangers. Not that I want to talk about it. The point being this: get your tickets from Gametime. Get your tickets without stress. Gametime is committed to finding you ways to save money on tickets. The closer it gets to first pitch or the puck drop or tip off, the more money you save. You can save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. You get flash deals and zone deals. You get all-in pricing. So when you peruse the tickets for the event, there's no surprises when you put those tickets into your cart. And in just a few taps, you can get those tickets delivered directly to your phone. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today for last-minute tickets with the lowest prices, guaranteed. So Miami in the back 7 versus Baltimore last year. I'll say this: Roquan Smith is a totally different kind of animal. And I remember when Roquan Smith was kind of on the trade block out of Chicago, and Baltimore trades for him. A lot of Dolphins fans that kind of had some questions. And had I known that this was the path that it was going to go on versus the Brian Flores-esque, Josh Boyer-esque scheme that the Dolphins had at the time, Roquan Smith, I'd probably been a little bit more warm on the idea of moving for Roquan Smith if I knew the defensive staff evolution was going to take on this much of an evolution over the past 2 years, 3 years. But nevertheless, you don't have Roquan Smith. You do have a comparable player to Patrick Queen, I think, in David Long. I think Jordan Brooks has a lot of upside for playing in this scheme and being a quality starter as well. I think he's kind of slept on a little bit for what he does in the passing game, from a degree of difficulty of assignments perspective, he can really run. He can get downhill. He can hit. You saw David Long really emerge as a run defender for the Dolphins last year as that season went on, and he developed more comfort within that scheme. So I think you have players in David Long and Jordan Brooks who are both respectfully, like, I think David Long is equal to Patrick Queen, and I think Jordan Brooks is maybe a half step down from Patrick Queen. None of them obviously equal to Roquan. So Miami's linebacker 1 is probably on par with what Baltimore's linebacker 2 was. Miami's linebacker 2, just a tick down from what Baltimore's linebacker 2 was last year. But those were the guys that played the snaps, right? They were both over 1,000 snaps. The third linebacker, Malik Harrison, 197 snaps. If that's Anthony Walker Jr.'s role on this team, I think Miami has a better player at linebacker 3, but of course, at that snap share percentage, it doesn't move the needle a whole lot versus being kind of a half step down for both of your top 2 guys. And then Duke Riley and Channing Tindall. Channing Tindall's a total unknown, but Duke Riley versus Trent Simpson is a rookie who played 46 snaps. I think your fourth linebacker spot's in a better position than what Baltimore had last year too. So I think you have a deeper linebacker room. I don't know that you necessarily want those guys to play at a high rotation level, especially with the disguising that's going to be going on in this defense. So I think Miami's in good shape here. I don't think they have the elite player. And anytime you have that drop-off, like that drop-off is felt. But nevertheless, I do think Miami has – you line them up just about everywhere else. And I think they got the goods here. I'm going to be totally honest. With one caveat. Baltimore had 2 cornerstone players at safety in Marcus Williams and Kyle Hamilton. Marcus Williams played 636 snaps. Kyle Hamilton played 937 snaps. Javon Holland is a cornerstone for the Dolphins defense. I know there's a lot of Dolphins fans that maybe want to see him make more impact plays. Felt like he was getting ready to turn the corner before he had the MCL sprains last year. Had the big play against the Jets. Had the forced fumbles against the Broncos. I think this scheme has the ability to move him around quite a little bit. They moved around Hamilton, but they also moved around Geno Stone to some degree. But they also played Marcus Williams in the high post, and I think Holland can do all those things. But this defensive secondary is going to be predicated around what they do with Jalen Ramsey. So much so that I think the closest thing the Dolphins have to Kyle Hamilton is Jalen Ramsey. I think Jalen Ramsey's ability to play in the nickel, to play outside, to play press, to play off, to play zone, to play deep, to play with vision, to tackle in the alley and run support, to blitz. He did none of that last year, right? Like he did none of that. He was just, oh yeah, you're going to play outside corner. But that's what made Kyle Hamilton go and be the chess piece and the move piece. And Ramsey maybe not as big as Kyle Hamilton, but he showcased between his last 2 years with the Rams the versatility that was needed to do a lot of the same things. So if you just take Jalen Ramsey and you classify him as a defensive back in the same way that Kyle Hamilton is a defensive back and is almost his own subcategory, and you measure out the rest of the safety room where you have Holland to match with Marcus Williams and you have Jordan Poyer to match with Geno Stone. I think those are both adequate starter caliber players. Geno Stone left in free agency, and I know he had a lot of ball production last year, but just the overall caliber of player, I think Poyer's on par with, even at this stage of his career. Marlon Humphrey at this stage of his career with the injuries, I think Kendall Fuller's on par with as a quality starter. Brandon Stevens / Arthur Mole with Kader Kohu. I think those are both adequate level starter players, especially the more that you can get Kader in man coverage. I think the more it helps him. Cam Smith is a bit of a wild card that can maybe emerge to be a third safety that's an impact player. The fourth outside corner or the third outside corner for Baltimore last year was Rock Ya-Sin. He played almost 300 snaps. If that's a Nick Needham type spot, and Needham is going to kind of amorphous be your CB4 and your safety 4 potentially, or Saron Neal, whatever. Those are quality depth type of players, and what Baltimore had were quality depth type players too. So you have this chess piece, that's a cornerstone, that's amorphous and moves all around and sets everything with your defense. Miami has that player in Jalen Ramsey. And I'm not going to get into whether he's playing his snaps here, there, or everywhere, right? The point being, they have the multi-tool piece. And then you look at the safeties, removing that from the mix. Williams for Holland and Stone for Poyer, I think, are equal players. Humphrey for Fuller, Stevens for Kohu, Mole and Cam Smith, Rock Ya-Sin for Nick Needham. Like, I think everything's on par there. And I know Cam Smith didn't play last year. I know what he looked like in training camp. I know what his college tape looked like. I got some pretty high expectations he's going to be part of the mix. And that third corner for Baltimore, like the nickel played 400 snaps. It's Cam Smith versus Kader Kohu versus Nick Needham, right? Like, who's going to be the CB2? Because that player, if you're in base, it'll be Jalen Ramsey. But when you're not, that player's going to have to come on the field, and that role was filled by Eli Apple last year. It not being Eli Apple is already a step in the right direction. So that's the part that I think is most obvious and interesting, is you've seen Miami kind of go after everything from a personnel usage standpoint that Baltimore had. Depth on the edge, depth inside. 9 guys were at 280 snaps or more. Miami's got the depth to take those snaps. Who's going to emerge out of Miami's kind of hoarded group of inside guys? And is there one more move to be made? I don't know. But you have a definitive 2 starters on the second level. You have a defensive weapon, and I think you can match what Baltimore played with last year and go blow for blow in the secondary and feel like you have equal caliber players, some different strengths, but an adequate starter for an adequate starter, a quality starter for a quality starter, 2 cornerstones for 2 cornerstones, like all across the board. You're a tick below at linebacker from last year's group. You're a tick better on the edge, and I think you're player short on the interior. And that's how Miami stacks up versus Baltimore last year. And that Ravens defense, obviously Mike McDonald is a big part of that puzzle, right? Like, Mike McDonald was the guy who was hired to go take that defense to Seattle and bring it with him and kind of transplant that scheme. But Baltimore averaged 16.5 points per game allowed last year. They were first in scoring defense. You know what else they were? They were first in net yards per attempt against at 4.7 yards per attempt. They were third in the league in interceptions with 18. They were second in the league in touchdowns allowed passing the football. They were first in the league in takeaways with 31. They had a ton of sacks. Miami had a ton of sacks last year too, granted. But Baltimore had 60 sacks last year as a team. Now, you don't measure up everywhere, but you're in the ballpark. And I think you're probably 1 player short in total. But 1.5 players short, because you're not going to equal Roquan Smith, period. You're just not. But I think there's a realm of possibility, which we're at midseason and we say the Dolphins have 2 quality starters at linebacker with David Long and Jordan Brooks. I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility at all. I think you're a guy inside on the front short, particularly a nose tackle, somebody to equal a Michael Pierce from having a really, really good chance to have this thing settle in and be a really, really good unit. Now, you still got to go out and do that, of course, but that's why I play the games. That's going to do it for us here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. Hope you're enjoying your long weekend. And I will be back again tomorrow with more Miami Dolphins talk coming your way. Fins up.